In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
We've got to get the government out of government!
It just don't add up!
And I'm gonna stay right here and fight for this lost cause. Even if this room gets filled with lies like these, somebody will listen to me.
Solid Principles.
Hello and welcome to episode 21 of Solid Principles. My name is Craig Edwards, and I'd like to thank you for joining us. As part of our 2010 Contender series, we head to the 8th Congressional District of California and speak with entrepreneur John Dennis, the man challenging House Speaker Nancy Pelosi this November.
Solid Principles.
When challenging a well-known incumbent, it has the tendency to monopolise the focus of talking points about the campaign. Bearing that in mind, let's place Nancy Pelosi aside for a moment and let's just speak about you. Could you share with us your background prior to your intention in throwing in your hat into the Californian 8th Congressional District race?
Sure can. And by the way, it's a great question, and I agree that tends to happen, except I've really not spent as much time as people probably want me to on Nancy Pelosi because I have my own political philosophy that's much more important to me than anything that she does. And she's just emblematic of everything that's wrong with the federal government. So my background was I grew up in Jersey City. My father was a longshoreman. My mother a city hall clerk. Grew up in a housing project until I was 13. Went to Catholic schools, Jesuit prep school, had a small scholarship there, went to a Jesuit university where I met my future partners in a company we co-founded that's now known as Human Scale. Human Scale is a maker of ergonomic products. It's primarily known as an office seating maker. Privately held company, does about $200 million a year. It's perennially named one of the top 10 design firms in the world. And for the last 10 years, I've been a real estate investor. We had our daughter about 4 years ago, and I've always had strong political convictions, was not terribly optimistic about getting involved in politics, but decided that things had gotten to a point where I had to do that, had to try. And so I got involved in politics a couple of years ago. I worked on some local campaigns and was looking for a candidate in this election who would say the things that I wanted to hear them say, and a candidate who would say them in a way that I wanted to hear them said. And finally, I just decided to be that candidate. So that's how we are.
Was there any particular event that prompted you to enter the race? Could you cite a particular moment where you decided, that's it, I'm going to run?
Well, I was approached late winter of 2008 to run in that election. It just wasn't, I didn't feel like I was ready for that. And then I was asked by the same people again, and I just think that what we're in right now, this malaise, if you will, it's not going away anytime soon, that the policies that we're following are going to extend it for many years to come, and that we need more voices for individual liberty and free markets out there.
Well, this is your first run for office. You mentioned before you've been involved in working on other campaigns. Can that outsider factor help you in San Francisco, being identified as an outsider?
Yeah, well, I think so. And I figured for my first election I would aim low and just go after, the third most powerful person in America. So, yeah, I think so. I mean, it seems to be, I haven't spent my life building a resume, to go into politics. And I think that's refreshing to most people. I have my faults as a candidate, faults as a person, but I'm just going to give people the raw truth and tell things the way I see them, and we'll let the chips fall where they may. I think that that's going to be refreshing because those are the kinds of candidates that I find appealing, and I think that there's an audience for that out there.
Well, John, please excuse this next devil's advocate factor about this next question, but San Francisco is the heart of American liberalism, the home of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who you are challenging. An outsider would point out that you being a Republican, that would make you the most popular kid on the block and that your chances of victory are slim. John, what would you say to the naysayers?
I would say that I agreed with them before, when we started the campaign. I mean, our goals were much more modest than, winning in the conventional sense. In this election, we set out to do other things, to get our message out and just do other things. We had other objectives. But the truth is that during the campaign, the hardcore volunteers that we have were very enthusiastic and committed to the campaign. We all, within about a week's time at one point, realized with our contacts in the Democratic Party, and not in the party, but with Democratic voters and independent voters, that there were a lot of votes to win. And then we all started doing the math and saying, well, if this scenario played out, and then most of us came to the conclusion that it is possible for us to actually win this thing. And, political consultants have said, don't talk about that because people won't take you seriously. But then after the Scott Brown election, everyone's asking us about it now. So the truth is that there are a lot of Democrats who are very upset with Nancy Pelosi for all of the things that she does and for everything she seems to represent and just her overall arrogance and hubris. So that's going to work in our favor. And, independents their frustration level is incredibly high. I think the real issue for us right now is if we can execute the campaign, stick with the message that we think it will connect with people, I think that Nancy Pelosi might at the end of the day be a paper tiger.
Continuing on about the recent Massachusetts Senate election that you mentioned, it was a traditional blue state stronghold. The Democrats and independents swung towards Brown. And can this really happen in San Francisco? I mean, could you see the unthinkable happen this year where you see the late Ted Kennedy's seat go towards Scott Brown? You could see Mark Kirk in Illinois pick up Barack Obama's old Senate seat. And if you defeat Nancy Pelosi, that's quite a hell freezes over scenario.
Well, there you have it, It was Barack Obama's seat, and I think it might have been Paul Simon's seat at one point, another staunch liberal in Illinois. If we perform the way that Scott Brown performed in Massachusetts with independents, then we're well on our way. The reality, though, is that as we talk to independents here are far more frustrated with Nancy Pelosi than those in Massachusetts, and we could actually do better. So we're in the game.
The last time you saw an environment like this, that the Republicans had such a momentum going into a midterm, was in the 1994 midterms, the so-called contract with America tactic that saw Republicans gaining the House and the Senate. Also, another factor to consider in the last midterms in 2006, that President Bush's approval rating was at 40%. At the time of this interview, some polls have indicated and placed Barack Obama at 44%. Do you think there might be enough for the Republicans to gain in November, or do you think maybe the Democrats are going to try to remind voters about the Bush years that also could prompt the Republicans into making an updated contract with America just to reassure voters?
Yeah, well, that's already happening out there. There's another contract with America thing. It's got a different name. I think it's a contract from America is the new one that's being driven by a guy by the name of Jason Chavetz, who had an upset victory in Utah recently. The Republicans had a lot of momentum, even though they had lost the presidency in 92. There was still momentum in the House and in the Senate prior to that for them, and so what they had to overcome was not quite as much as the Republicans have to do now. But sure, it's possible. I mean, they could do it, and you'll certainly see that, and you will certainly see the Democrats pull out all the stops. They will constantly remind people about George Bush, and expect to see that if I actually, within striking distance of Nancy Pelosi, you'll see them pull all kinds of tricks like that with me, whereas the truth of the matter is that I was very frustrated with my own party while George Bush was in power, because this party grew the federal government faster than any administration since LBJ. And that's one of the reasons that drove me into politics in the first place, was frustration with my own party. So sure, they're going to try and do everything, pull out all the stops, but we'll see how it plays out. I'm not so sure it's going to be successful.
I'm going to share with you a conversation I had with an acquaintance last night. And he mentioned to me, at the moment, the only alternative the Republicans are offering is that they will stop Barack Obama, where Barack Obama came into office under the guise of he was not George W. Bush. Now, this is where it becomes an interesting scenario. Where does the Republican Party go after they pull off their first trick, which is stop Barack Obama? Where does it head after that if they are successful in November?
Well, this is where I probably show my political naivete by not having been in politics for a long time. It won't be good enough for me just to get Barack Obama out. If you replace Barack Obama with someone, equally inept and ideologically off base, what have you gained? So over the holidays, I read Barry Goldwater's Conscience of a Conservative. I was reminded that when the Republicans had control of all three branches of the federal government in the early 50s, they behaved much the same way they did in the early part of the 2000s, in that they grew the government faster than the previous big spending Democratic administration. That's just not acceptable, and it's not even feasible this time around. So we have to go in with the goal in mind of actually changing government and reducing its size and start driving the government back into the confines of its constitutional constraints. If we don't, then I'm afraid that the America that we know is going to be under serious threat.
Well, you mentioned the early 50s there, and I've just been finishing reading a book called